the purpose, or what we were trying to kind of convey, was to walk people through what a mastering session with me might be like. So I asked this question this morning. I know the answer from some of you, but I'll ask it again. Of you, how many of you have been to a mastering session with a sort of another mastering engineer? Hello again. Hello. Cool. So quite a few of you. I guess every engineer is kind of going to approach them differently, but fundamentally, probably the kind of outlying goal would be the same. Has anyone heard of an engineer called Mandy Parnell? Anyone come across her? She's a very good mastering engineer, and she put it very well when she says that what she tries to do is to understand the feeling that a recording is trying to give to the listener, and then she will try and enhance that feeling, which all sounds quite airy-fairy and New Age crystals, but it's kind of correct, really. With mastering, it's, as I said this morning, there's a degree of kind of technical and a degree of creative, and it's a combination of those two things. What I had hoped to do is play a track which I've recently mastered, and we were going to kind of walk it through like you guys were my clients, and you're going to tell me how it sounds when we're here in our mastering studio, and we're going to try and make some changes if we think it needs to have some changes. So to a certain extent, that's what we're going to do, but instead of actually being able to make the changes, we're just going to be talking about them. I do apologise for that. So before we get started, who can tell me why this is not going to work, apart from the fact that it isn't working? What's the fundamental thing that we're trying to do that kind of... We need to listen.
The room is not enough.
Exactly. This isn't a mastering room. This is a kind of a cinema thing with a bit of a lash-up sound system. If I was really going to be trying to master a record for one of you guys, I'd hope it would be in an environment that was maybe a bit more controlled than this. So what we're doing is an approximation. So I'm going to play you a track. This is it's signed to a French label, and I don't know if it's out yet, but it's a part of a digital EP by a group, one of 4 tracks, and I mastered it quite recently. I'm just going to play it to you, and we're just going to have a listen, and I guess I'd like you to kind of partly put yourselves in the role of mastering engineer. So listen, see how it makes you feel, and we'll play a few minutes of it, and then at the end of it I'm going to ask you to kind of tell me what you think about the mix, how you feel, blah blah blah, and we're going to go from there. So, there we go. That bit where the sub bass kicked in, that was just him doing something back there. Yeah. That's not in the... Yeah, you had the cut on. And so, we're mastering engineers, so we've listened to that recording in our acoustically perfect environment. And what do we hear? Come back to me. What did you hear? A lot of bass? There is a lot of noise, yeah. Bit light in the mids. Yeah. All for the purposes of the experiment, we have to accept that this is the perfect listening environment, and what we're hearing is the truth. It kind of doesn't matter. The point is to put us in the mind of what a mastering engineer might be thinking. So someone said a bit too much bass. For me, what I hear, slightly thrown by when the sub bass kicked in, I kind of hear like, I like the subs, but the bass guitar is maybe a bit too kind of thick. Do you know what I mean? And the low mids, that's sort of 150 to 250.
Yeah, instead of sort of adding to the groove and the glue, it tends to sort of leak all over the bottom end.
Exactly, yeah. It kind of splurges and makes it sound a bit... Musically, it's more interesting, but kind of sonically, it's a bit like there.
Distortion on the mid frequencies as well. Like snare was a kind of
the snare is quite thin and brittle sounding. Distortion possibly introduced by the replay, but no, I totally agree. Anything else? Anyone else get anything from it?
The pads at the start that were faded in and out really stuck out. They were very high in volume.
They were very loud. Very loud.
any kind of codec they're using, maybe like surrounding kind of things for the cinema.
Yes.
Kind of
Basically, in terms of what we're hearing, I think a lot's being folded into the centre, which is kind of possibly altering how we're hearing. But basically, all these kind of things that you're hearing are the kind of things that we would listen for. And so then we have to think about how we're going to approach fixing the problem. My first thought with a track like this would be to clean up the bass guitar. So I'd probably start by just getting an EQ, getting a nice big boost on it, and just flicking around between 150 to 250 and hear where that bass guitar line is really kind of ringing and really at its strongest. And then I just pull that down by a dB to a couple of dB and see how that affects the groove. If I do that, can anyone tell me what the first or some things that might change apart from the bass guitar? Any thoughts? Kick. So the top end of the kick, we're going to lose a bit of that, a bit of the click. Anything else? Snare. Exactly. Two of the things that have been mentioned. Snare. If we start pulling out the low mids, we're going to start thinning out the snare, and the snare was already thin. So we know that we need to be a bit careful and be a bit kind of clever about it. The next thing I'd probably do is just strap on some compression to see when we've done that, what was the overall effect. Has the bass guitar started to sit in the mix, and does the compression give me a bit more of the snare? Does it thicken out the snare? When I compress stuff, if I'm working on the stereo mix, as I usually am as a mastering engineer, for compression, if I'm using single band compression, I'm going to try probably using something that has a side chain where I can cut out the low frequency. If I'm working on electronic music, the nature of which we tend to be talking about today, so that the compressor isn't being massively driven by a huge kick drum. I can just filter to 120 or 150 hertz or something, and the side chain of the compressor is just looking at what's going on above that. With this track, we'd probably find that the snare kind of thickened out a bit. Because we've taken the bass line down, I'd probably look to maybe just see what's going on in the low subs. Very difficult to hear what was going on in the low subs, but I'd want to double check that we still had plenty in the sort of 30 to 50 hertz region. So although we've kind of thinned out the lower end of the track by pulling the bass guitar down, hopefully we've still got plenty of kind of low end punch through on the kick. Next, I'd kind of address sort of 80 to 90 hertz, and really I'd be looking at the octave below the octave that we've pulled out. So let's say on the bass guitar we've ducked out 190 hertz, which can be a bit of an ugly frequency. What's half of 190? Yeah, 95? Yeah. I'd then start looking to see what's going on at 95, because what I might find is that I can actually reinforce that a little bit. So we know about octaves and how they relate to frequency. Yeah, if you want to find, the octave up is either double and the octave below will be half. So if we've pulled out at 190, I might just have a little look around, see what's going on in that sort of 80 to 90, because we might find that we can get some kind of vibe going on with the bass. We've ducked out the ugly part of it, but if that's the ugly part, maybe the octave below the bass is actually a bit nicer, and we don't lose too much of the actual what the bass guitar is playing. We've just picked a nicer sounding bit of it. Next up, kind of fattening the track out. Any thoughts about how we might go about doing that, if we had any tools available to us at our disposal? Distortion. On this particular recording, because it sounds distorted anyway, and with the caveat it might be the speakers, stereo enhancing.
Maybe bring up some of the high mids and the side with the guitar and maybe a little bit of the hats as well.
Yep. This is
Some of the harmonic elements of the notes that are being played.
Yep. Yep. Yep, this is all good stuff. What I'm thinking, or what my next thought process would be, we need to try and make the snare sound a bit better. It sounds thin and it sounds a bit shit. So I'd probably look to maybe a bit of mid-side compression. I'd probably do something a bit more straightforward, like just actually get a nice warm sounding EQ and see what's going on in the mid-range. If I'm working in the box, maybe something like the Sony Oxford EQ, or if I'm working analog, maybe in my current studio there's an Avalon big Class A passive EQ, something like that, and just see maybe a bit of 500 or 600 hertz. We can just push in a dB on quite a nice broad Q that is going to, if we go high enough up, it's not going to pull up too much of that ugly bass, but we can just get a bit of thickness into the snare. Okay. Other than that, I'd say the track just needs to be made louder. And that's kind of where I'd go to next. Has anyone ever sent something off for mastering? Isn't that a weird thing? Like, you spend ages working on this track and you hone it to the point where you think, yeah, that's as good as I can get it, and then you sort of send it off into the ether for mastering and you get something back. I find that really, really weird. I try not to work that way, although people do often send me stuff and, they don't actually physically sit in with me. It should really be about communication. Any good mastering engineer, they're not sort of separate from the project. They're just like another part of the production process. And it's not their project, it's your project or your project. The lines of communication should be as good as possible. So if you're working with someone, you're mastering this track at X mastering in wherever, speak to them and say, this is how I like to work, or this is how I've worked on this track. Is this okay for you? And if they come back and say something different, say, okay, we can do that, but can I give you this version as well? Because sometimes people do mix into a compressor or maybe mix into a limiter, and then you print the mix without it, and it's a completely different record. And you liked it when it was printed through the limiter and what have you, and you don't like it now, but you're going to send it off to someone and hope that they somehow recapture what you did and make it better. They might do, or they might not, but it's probably better if they at least have the option of working on the thing that you like anyway. Do you know what I mean? So if it's with me, I prefer to not have anything on the mix bus. I prefer people just to mix a record without anything on the mix bus. But if you want to do that, then do it. And, you know, give me the option. What I do find quite funny is when people send me like a heavily limited mix, but they like run it through the limiter and then turn it down like -6. So there's like, it's 6 dB below peak, but it's still like slammed to bits. That's kind of pointless. Do you know what I mean? I can take your heavily limited mix, and if I want, I can turn it down 6 dB in my computer. Do you know what I mean? You don't need to do that. The point about, I guess, kind of headroom in a mix that we're talking about is more sort of dynamic headroom. So if you're bringing a track into me, what I would like and what I would ask for is ideally nothing on the mix bus. But if you're going to put some compression on there, that's cool. Just get the compression that you like for the sound. Don't worry about how loud this file is in relation to any other file that has ever been recorded. Just when you're listening to it, get the sound that you want. If you find that it's not loud enough, just turn the volume up, as in just like that. Spooky. Has anyone heard of a guy called Switch? He's in Major Lazer with Diplo. Does a lot of work with Mia, but he did a remix of a thing that I cut. It was probably about 10 years ago under the alias Solid Groove, which is one of his other aliases. He did do This Is Sick, yeah. This was the first time I worked with him, which was before we did This Is Sick. And he did a remix of a track, and it was so like slammed, and it was the loudest recording I think I'd ever heard. But I mean, it did sound good, but you know, I was much younger then. This is, you know, probably about 2003. So thinking that I knew better, as I kind of used to do sometimes, now I know that I don't know better, which is the benefit of getting older. I phoned him up and I said, you know, can you just send me one without all this limiting on, because I can't possibly do anything with it. And he was just like, look, it's great how it is, do your thing and it will be better. I promise you, this is the way I work and it's better and it will work. I was like, okay, you know, I'll try it. And fucking hell, it was brilliant. Do you know what I mean? We just put a little bit of EQ. I was actually using this EQ, bit of Mazalek EQ, where I just EQ'd a bit of punch into the kick drum, sort of 126 hertz, I think it is on this one, and a little bit of probably about 1.5K, just to make sure the snares kind of cut through, and back into another limiter to kind of recapture the level that he'd got, and it sounded stunning. And the Sick and, you know, various other tracks, it just totally works. Which is why when people say you can't do that, they're wrong. You can. It tends to not work. It tends to be that when people heavily... The reason mastering engineers say don't limit your stuff is it means that we can't do very much to it, right? Which, first of all, we want to do something. Do you know what I mean? We've got all this gear. We want to do something. Which is something that I try and fight against. Do you know what I mean? I try and remember that I'm not getting paid by the amount of knobs I turn. Do you know what I mean? But secondly, obviously, mastering engineers are quite good at enhancing audio in general, or we like to think we are. So, you know, quite often the thought process is, well, if you took that limiter off, I could actually do a better job. That usually is the case, but there are times that it isn't. And I always just try and remember, it's not my record. And, you know, I can offer guidance and I can offer an opinion, but at the end of the day, it's not my name on the record. So it doesn't, you know, it doesn't matter if I'm ignored. I mean, when we did, not so much on the second James Blake record that we've just done, but on the first one, James basically printed all his mixes slammed through the limiter in Logic. And on most tracks, I just ran it through a valve compressor, but with no gain reduction, but just getting a bit of kind of valve sound. I don't know what that even means, but a bit of something. Do you know what I mean? A bit of coloration, a bit of who knows what, and you know, a dB of EQ here and there, and that was pretty much the sound of that record. And in places, it sounds stunning. You know, with EQ, it's very easy to cut bass, and you can cut a lot of bass, and a mix will still sound natural. And likewise with top, you can add a lot of top, and a mix will still sound natural. The other way around, it's very, very difficult. When you take top out of a mix, you're taking treble out of everything within the mix. So you're taking treble out of the bass line, you're taking treble out of the mid-range, taking treble out of the kick drums and stuff. And so everything automatically starts to feel a bit more like this. Even though it might still be the loudest, the brightest thing in the world, it feels kind of psychoacoustically a bit weird. And same with adding bass. When you try and add a lot of bass, it becomes unrhythmic. You start to get kind of sort of waffly, dirgy stuff, yeah, which can be a cool effect, but in general, you start to lose the groove on something. But always, obviously, we'd prefer everything to just sound as good as possible, and that kind of makes our lives easier. What I find works really well is going into analog. Which can be difficult to do on a budget, which is not me being patronising, but when you go out into analog, obviously you're going through a DA, and you're then going to have to come back through an AD to capture what you've done. And when we do that in mastering studios, we obviously use very expensive converters and very expensive wire and stuff, and that's not me saying, you know, look at all our fancy stuff and aren't we clever? But you're going to lose a certain amount of stuff by going into analog. I usually do that because I find that I can then get a bit more depth and space by using analog EQ and compression than I can generally with digital stuff. So I'm willing to make that trade-off of the conversion process, but I do it knowing that I've got some, you know, expensive converters that are doing an accurate job of making the conversion. Without those working in digital, I find that my kind of, when I'm staying all in the digital domain, for me, it's usually when I'm not looking to put sort of depth and space in. It's usually when I'm looking to kind of keep the sort of punch and attack on stuff, and maybe have stuff that's quite present and quite, you know, sort of forthright coming out of the mix, because analog can slow down the attack on transients, can make things sound a bit more boring, a bit more slow, and you can lose a bit of the excitement on stuff. In terms of kind of putting, you have to be careful when you say this because it's easy to get carried away, but you know, doing stuff in MS can really help, and maybe pushing in the mid-range in the side channel. So MS would be M being mid, all the mono information, and S being all the side information, which is all out of phase. If you kind of push in mid-range, so sort of 500 to 800 hertz in the side channels, you can first of all, you're going to make the side channels louder, so you're going to make the whole thing wider, but obviously you're sort of doing it selectively. You're making the mid-range wider, but not the bass or the treble, so that can help give you depth. Other than that, I find less compression you know, if you're mastering your own thing, or if I'm mastering something and I feel that we don't have a lot of depth, it may well be that I've just hit it too hard in the compressor, and if I just back things off, maybe just drop the ratios down, you know, maybe I've got like 3:1 and 2:1 going on stuff, maybe it should be more like 1.6:1, 1.4:1, and maybe instead of, you know, 1.5 dB of gain reduction, I should be having only 0.5 dB of gain reduction, and that will allow us a bit more front to back perspective. Basically, my theory, and this is just my theory, and this is from a mastering engineer's perspective. I like to work on big speakers that are full range and give me a nice big physical sensation and fill the room. And I find that working on big speakers, if I make it sound good on those, my belief and my theory is that it will fold down to smaller speakers, to the car, to earbuds, because we've heard everything and we've made it sound right there. So by its nature, on a more limited replay system, it should still sound right. There are other people that like to reference different speakers. I find if you put more than one pair of speakers in the room, speaker cabinets are designed to vibrate, right? They're designed to resonate, and that gives you part of the frequency response of the speaker. The cabinet is integral to the speaker design and the frequency response. It's a resonant chamber. And if you put a resonant chamber next to your pair of speakers, it's going to resonate. I don't think I really want that. So I only have one pair of speakers in the mastering room. What I do is I do take stuff home and I do listen to it, you know, on my phone. I do listen to it on my hi-fi at home or in the car, when I want to get a different perspective. And sometimes I find that useful. Just as often I find that it completely throws me. Do you know what I mean? I did a thing on Thursday night which sounded amazing in my mastering room, and I burnt it onto CD. I was so pleased with myself. It was just one track. I thought, I'm going to listen to that in the car on the way home. Put it on in the car, and there was nowhere near enough treble on it and way too much bass. And so I got home and just thought, well, I'm going to need to redo that. Went back in on Friday, listened to it again in the mastering room. It sounds great. Sent it to the client. The client says it sounds great. It just sounded like whack in my car because I don't know, maybe I was tired, or you know, I was driving slowly, so I was getting more bass.
Head colder, so I've found that when you've got a cold sometimes.
Oh God, yeah, trying to work when you've got a cold is a nightmare. So for me, I like to have get to know one like sound reproduction system and kind of trust that and back my judgments on that, but occasionally referencing outside. With mixing, I think it's a totally different thing. You know, having something like an Auratone, or you know, NS10s are always the classic one, which were like there's no bass and there's no top on them, but it's just a shitload of high mid, so it's very easy to tell how loud the vocal is in relation to the snare drum and the melody part or whatever. So for mixing, I think it can be really, really useful, and I think it's advisable to listen when mixing on a variety of different sources. The other thing is the standing in the door test. Standing in the wind. Standing in the door when you're mixing. If you're printing a mix, turn the screen off and maybe just like, instead of sitting right between the speakers and, you know, just wandering over to the door, maybe opening the door. Opening the door to your room will change the acoustics anyway. But it's actually really good to listen kind of off axis. You'll hear things differently, and you might hear something that's too loud or too quiet. That means you can actually go back in and tweak the mix and get a better result. It might actually teach you. You might learn something. I think really important is the way gear is connected. More so in a mastering studio probably than any other kind of studio, because as I've said earlier on today, when you're working on just the stereo file, as it were, any changes you make are kind of more noticeable. There's less place to hide. So anything that you run it through, if there's a weakness in it, it's going to affect everything. Whereas, you know, if you're recording vocals and the mic lead's not the best lead in the world, it's not going to affect the drums. It's just on the vocal mic.
The process still would be extremely helpful.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, we did, and not always the most expensive stuff. I mean, we did. This is the story of my life, but we did quite a lot of cable shootouts when I was working at Air, and we got 4 or 5 different loops of cable, and we basically had them all coming up on an analog router, so you could just punch in and listen to the signal going through just a 1-foot loop of cable. And the best one was this cable made by this French company, which was €1,000 for 1.5 meters. And literally, you literally couldn't hear. Do you know what I mean? It's like you could punch the button in and out, and you couldn't hear when it was going through the cable or not. But it was €1,000 for 1.5 meters. We managed to blag 1.5 meters for the test, and that was the only cable from this company that we ever used because we just couldn't afford to buy any more. But the second best cable was £2 a meter, and it was by a company called Hella Sound, which is HELA Sound, and they're a German company, and they make not just audio cables but Cat5 cables and computer routing cables and stuff. And I can't remember what the name of this cable was, but it's black and it was £2 a meter, and that was better than the Van Dam cable and better than the Megami and all that sort of stuff. So it's not necessarily the most expensive, but for me, I try and keep cable runs short. If I'm connecting analog stuff, I'm on XLRs. I'm not on jacks because I think it's a better connection. It's all that kind of thing. And yeah, if you can afford to kind of upgrade, I don't think you'll regret it. The most important thing that I think you can upgrade if you're looking to make a change is to upgrade your monitors or your acoustics. That is one thing that will improve everything that you do and make every box that you have sound better and make every mix that you do sound better. It's the one thing that is a win for everything. I really like Dynaudios for they kind of don't have too much of a sound. Do you know what I mean? But they can output plenty of welly. I'm loath to say neutral because nothing is neutral, but I find Dynaudios really easy to listen to and really easy to work on because they don't. DYN audio. I find them really, really good. They're not hyped in the bass. Other than that, if you want something that's a bit more kind of hi-fi, but still really, really good to work on, there's a French company called Focal, which is Focal, and they make monitors that are a bit more hyped, a bit more bright, a bit more push in the bottom end. But they are really, I like mixing on them. The DA that feeds your speakers is also really, really important. A lot of people are listening on, value for money sound cards, should we say, which is, not a diss because, I own a studio myself and I know there's 1,000,001 things that I should have in my studio and that I want, and I can't afford them. But obviously everything that's going through your monitoring DA is going to your speakers. Every single thing you have, you're listening to through that. If you can afford an upgrade there, it's well worth it. I really like things like RM. I think RME is a very good company for sound cards. So they have some nice products. Something like the Lynx Aurora is quite good value for money for however many channels you get. That's like 16, I think. I've worked in a mastering studio that we used the Lynx Aurora in it, and it was cool. Do you know what I mean? It sort of was pretty much mastering grade, and I don't know how much they are, like £1,500 or something, £1,200. So those two are really good. The Prism Orpheus is a really, really good sounding unit. I don't know if anyone's seen this. We put it up against the larger Prism, which is the older, more expensive Prism Dream, and I think that sounds just as good, and it's a bit cheaper. And they've just launched another small one as well. So they're a sort of good British company. So there's kind of good stuff out there, really.
How loud do you listen to? Do you do your masters? Sometimes when it's like quiet, I might guitar or stuff, the bass or the treble, and am I really like turning it up? I sometimes feel that's a bit too much.
Yeah. When mastering, I listen reasonably loud. Probably when I'm actually EQing something, I'll be listening to it just a bit louder than someone would be listening at home if they were like listening to it at an enjoyable level, if you can kind of picture where that is. So just a little bit, like we're not into we're having a party territory, we're just a fraction above I'm listening to this record. And then when I'm printing a track, so when I've made my decisions and I'm recording it back in or whatever, I'll then turn it down, partly because I want to give my ears a break, because ear fatigue is, that's going to fuck up all your judgments. But also because when you listen quietly, you are going to have a different experience and you might hear something that is different. The bass response will change. Like I said, speaker cabinets are, for the most part, designed to resonate, and part of the bass response will come from the resonance of the cavity, and the more signal you drive through the chamber, the more it will resonate, the more bass you'll get. So you turn stuff up, you get more bass. When you turn it down, you find the bass changes and kind of falls away a little bit. So you will be hearing the actual sound differently. But with mixing, it's a lot easier to balance the important kind of loudness of different parts when you're listening quietly. Listen loud for vibe. How does it make me feel? Do I want to get up off the chair and dance around the room? Is it exciting? But in terms of should the vocal be a dB up or a dB down, you probably want to turn it down for that. And just don't listen too loud too long. And the final point, because I think we need to wrap this up, is it's really important to look after your ears, which is... It's hard enough for me as a mastering engineer, but if there are you out there who like DJ and stuff as well as make tracks, it's really, really easy to fuck up your ears, especially as a DJ. Do take care of them, because you will find my hearing has changed. I'm 38 now. My hearing has changed from when I started at the age of 21, and I'm hoping to do this job for at least another 25 years. Do you know what I mean? So protect your ears. The end. So I do apologise that we didn't get the kit going. I hope you still got a few things from it. I think we need to wrap it up. If I'm going to be floating around, if you've got any further questions, come and say hello.